Mr. Fetzer held as part of his mission and legacy seemingly Masonic notions of America as the great spiritual experiment of freedom. In a 1989 archival interview, Mr. Fetzer said regarding his mission, I quote, "We have to carry it out till we get to the end of the line so that we really can find out what self-awareness is. You know, when the founding fathers of the country started to do this, coming up with the Declaration of Independence and all that, they set something in motion. And 200 years later in the land, now we're looking back and we see what happened thus far. Maybe another 200 years down the line, we'll look back and see what really has happened." Unquote. And thus the Fetzer mission is commonly called around Fetzer a 400 to 500 year mission. But for Mr. Fetzer himself, he centers it on the founding fathers of the American enterprise. So it connects to the founding fathers of America and also connects with Mr. Fetzer's notions of spiritual awareness and spiritual freedom. So my first question for you, Akram, is, do you see a symbiotic connection between the Masonic influence on the American ideals of freedom and independence and on Mr. Fetzer's view of the long-term 400 to 500 year mission of the Fetzer Institute? So.
Well, absolutely. I see a lot of that, as a matter of fact. Let me start off by giving you my belief regarding the great experiment, and to build on what John described as a spiritual experiment. What typically is called the great experiment that is called America. Well, the founding fathers of the United States, of course, many of them, especially some of the more influential among them, such as, George Washington, James Madison, Ben Franklin, to name a few, who were Freemasons, were engaged in an enterprise. And the enterprise is building a new experiment that would not replicate what has taken place in the course of humanity, but more like to branch off, create something totally new that is rooted in a fundamental idea, and that idea is freedom. But to a Freemason, freedom has a dual nature. So we refer to it as enlightened freedom, and that's where you will see the spiritual component. There is the freedom of the obvious, the exoteric aspect of freedom. Freedom to work, freedom to move, freedom to worship, freedom to or freedom of. But then there is another aspect of freedom, which is the esoteric part, and that is being free from superstition, free from ignorance, free from tyranny, free from extremism, the kinds of things that would shackle the person. And when you think about it, at the heart of the experiment is that, is it possible for the human race not to repeat history? Or are we doomed? Are we always bound to repeat the past? History is very important, is prologue in many ways, but the whole idea of the experiment is that we can do better. And there is a way to constantly, by focusing on the future rather than the past, learn from the mistakes of the past, but focusing on the future as builders. And that explains to you the connection here as being a free Mason, free builder. We're constantly talking about the building of this experiment that is focusing on the future. And at the heart of that building process, there is a marriage that must be taken into account. And a Freemason is taught to do it on his own, but try to find that balance between the pursuit of knowledge. This is why learning the liberal arts, the sciences, is something that is mandated, that is, the Mason is encouraged to pursue. And along with that, the spiritual path. In other words, these two don't come into conflict. They basically converge and they come from the one source. And that is why the pursuit of the two and bringing them to some form of balance is very important. So the American experiment is fundamentally a spiritual experiment. It is an experiment in spirituality that is allowing humans of different nationalities, of different religions, of different cultures, of different backgrounds, ultimately of different races. I'll say ultimately because we know in the beginning there is the issue of racism was the cancer that the founders were very much aware of, but they decided to postpone until independence. And of course, we know from history what happened, and a horrible civil war almost destroyed the entire experiment to get rid of that cancer. But the idea is that, is it possible for people of these different backgrounds to be together, build, not coexist? Coexistence is irrelevant. We're talking about builders here. Can they build together a new concept of a community based on three pillars: that individual enlightened freedom, rule of the people, that is, can they govern themselves by themselves without needing a monarch, without needing some absolutist power that would dictate to them? And if you look at the world today, people, okay, do we need tyrants? Do we need dictators? And third, rule of law, that has the consent of the governed, and that even the rule of the people would not violate. So it's a tripod, and it is something to be built. But fundamentally, it is spiritual because we believe we all come from the one, and which explains to you the E pluribus unum, a motto of the great experiment, out of many one, which is very, very Masonic. So when I was reading, the writings, expression of beliefs of John, talking about body, mind, and soul, that resonated so much with me because that's what the 3 degrees, the fundamental degrees in Freemasonry are 3: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. All the higher degrees were established to help the master mason better understand the language of symbols of the 3 degrees. And the third one, the highest, is the spiritual. So can I become free physically, intellectually, and spiritually?
One of the things that Mr. Fetzer wrote about in America's Agony was this idea that the United States, when he was writing this, Mr. Fetzer in the 60s, was going through a kind of second American Revolution, and that this was an ongoing process that would lead to the next stage in the development of the United States. Is there a kind of Masonic take on that idea of the 60s and the early 70s being a second American Revolution?
And let me add just a little context on America's Agony then. This is the last chapter of John's second genealogy book that was published in '71. It's based on the story of George Washington at Valley Forge being visited in the depths of winter on the verge of failure by an angel, a goddess, perhaps the goddess Liberty would makes the most sense. And then she presented him the story of 3 perils. She called him the son of the Republic, look and listen. She talked about 3 perils, and the third peril was supposedly what America was going through at the time in the 60s. The third peril was the 60s thing. And John's take on it in the writing was that there was also an opportunity that America seemed to be on the verge of a new age as well. So, the broader question is it a Masonic story, and what is the Masonic take on this America's Agony essay that John wrote in 1971?
Well, let me preface my answer by saying what is fundamental and at the same time beautiful about the teachings of Freemasonry is that there is nothing prescribed. The whole idea is to avoid any dogmatic approach. The Mason is encouraged to seek the truth, so with a capital T, knowing that there are many paths to that. And in the process, as a builder here on earth, learn to respect the diversity of the paths of the seekers, ultimately reaching the same. So Freemasonry will never say, this is it, or this is a Masonic story. However, it is up to the individual to decipher the symbols and from that make his own. So I can fully understand, for example, how John Fetzer could describes the three trials and the three stages, because they exist in the 3 degrees, passing from one degree to another, and more importantly, in the 3rd degree, it all comes together in the ceremonies of the rituals, where the person has to go through the 3 trials. And the 3rd trial is the most difficult one, but the most decisive one, and that is the spiritual trial. That is, after establishing your physical freedom, and in this case, I would, if you want to create the analogy, the War of Independence, the establishment of the experiment, and the expansion of the country. And then the pursuit of knowledge, which is the intellectual one. This is where you saw industry, arts flourish in this country, the golden age, if you want. That is associated with the 2nd degree in Freemasonry. It comes the 3rd and the most difficult one, and that is the only way one can master his or her destiny. And that is, can you pass the 3rd trial, which is the spiritual one? If you look at the world today, since the 60s, I mean, I would concur personally. I wouldn't say this is what Masonry says, but I can understand from this language of symbols of Freemasonry, because the language of symbols of Freemasonry is not about abstract stuff. It is to help the individual, while seeking his own path, read through, understand symbols, become more attentive to signs, be able to use his senses and notice, smell, see things that others may not, because he has learned now to become attuned to that initiatic way of looking at things, and therefore can start putting certain pieces together that may not appear so obvious to the naked eye. So the initiated eye can and would act upon that. But it's still a free. This concept of freedom is very important. So it is the individual, and it's not the collect, it's not the group that is pursuing that, creating a group dynamic that will move, but not other group. So it's not group think, it's individual thinking, and then you get into teamwork, working together as a community to build. So I can see that if you look at from the 60s on, and today it's so prevalent. You see this, what many can describe, what I would describe as a state of crisis. And it's fundamentally spiritual. It is a crisis at the level of the spirit. Where are we going? Where is the experiment going? And if this trial, if we fail this stage, then the experiment would be definitely in danger of collapse. But I believe that we will succeed, not because I'm an optimist. I am. I profess to be an optimist. But I believe there are enough people who think the way I do and who will set things in motion and help create energies that will help us go past that. If you look, not only in America, so John was looking at the United States, we're going through that. But if you look at the world also today, you see the whole globe is going through that. But the difference is, if the American experiment fails this 3rd trial, passing this, overcoming it, then the human condition as a whole around the globe is endangered.
Where do you think Mr. Fetzer would have encountered these kinds of stories about the spiritual destiny of America? In the lodge, or would he have been directed to certain writings or books that he should have read? I'm interested because since political discourse within the lodge is banned, I'm wondering how you actually get to these kinds of these ideas.
It's a very important question, and what you mentioned is very true. And let me add, there are 3 topics that are banned from being discussed in a Masonic lodge: religion, politics, and business. However, the 3 are very important in the day-to-day life of citizens. So what happens in the lodge? What do we mean by we don't discuss politics, we don't discuss religion, and we don't do business, obviously. And that's very important. The business part is that we don't want to attract individuals who are looking for networks so they can sell life insurance or get ahead in business. That is not the purpose of the lodge. It is, so we call it disinterested friendship. It's very important. The person is coming to find an environment that will help him better himself, build better, open his eyes to certain things. That's why we say he's coming from darkness into light. That is, admitting no matter how much knowledge in the profane world he has, there are aspects, and that's the spiritual dimension, there are aspects of life that are really hidden unless the eye becomes initiated. But what happens, therefore, in the lodge? You have programs, educational programs that focus on the ritual, that focus on how the ritual and the tools of Freemasonry are put into practice. Not by saying this is the way, but this is how a Mason has done it. This is how X used that to do this. And you generate discussion, debate.
So you might be exposed to a variety of different kinds of takes on these issues.
Absolutely. These are all we call educational programs. And for example, it is encouraged in Masonic lodges to have programs that would help enlighten, educate individuals about the various religious traditions, not to advocate or promote, but to educate, because ignorance is one of the enemies that a Mason has to constantly conquer. I say constantly because it's like a virus. Ignorance, extremism, and tyranny, if you want to look at them from a scientific perspective, I like the medical because my dad was a doctor. So it's like viruses, they go to sleep. They mutate, and they wake up as soon as they see weakness in the system, in the body. And so you can never say we conquered them. It's a constant battle. And bigotry, racism, collective imagery are always used in that process. So learning more about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Deism from an educational perspective, that is very important. So like that, educational programs about the American Revolution, about the role that Freemasons want. Let me give you an interesting example. So not only programs, then you can go to references, also books that have been written on these. For example, I think it's important to know why Benjamin Franklin, what is the real secret behind the success of Benjamin Franklin while he was ambassador of the United States to France in getting support to the American Revolution, the American experiment effort. Putting aside his persona and his ability and his charm, and he was very good at that, Benjamin Franklin was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Philadelphia. And when he was our ambassador to France, he became what we call the worshipful master. By the way, worshipful has nothing to do with worship. That's Old English, meaning venerable, respectable. That is, he became the leader of the most interesting lodge in Paris. As U.S. ambassador, he was the head of that Masonic body in France. He conducted Voltaire, the luminary of the 18th century, his initiation into Freemasonry in that lodge. Our very own Ben Franklin. Think about that for a moment. And it is no coincidence, therefore, that Franklin reached out to Masons who were officers in European armies to come, and that explains to you why.
Lafayette.
Yeah, well, Lafayette, in fact, came on his own, I must admit.
But he was a Freemason.
But he was a Freemason. But others that were recruited, including in front of the White House, you have this wonderful park, Lafayette Park, named after Lafayette. But you have the Prussian von Steuben, you know, the Polish Kosciuszko. Almost every single one of the officers that came from Europe and fought, helped train the American militia and fought under George Washington in our War of Independence, were recruited by Ben Franklin using the network. In other words, reaching out to say, we're basically establishing this experiment. And Lafayette, for him, it was obvious. That's why it was obvious. It doesn't matter where this new spiritual experiment on Earth would take place. If America is the place, before France, so be it. So he was willing, though he was an aristocrat, a marquis, he was willing to put everything at risk and go fight that. And then, of course, went back and participated in the French experiment and ended up being jailed by the revolutionaries. So definitely, there's so these things are important. They were mainly told in programs, in educational programs, in Masonic meetings, and there are today. You find a lot of books. You find books in multiple languages, in fact, that would describe various aspects of that.
On a History Channel show, I've got a quote from you saying, America is much more than a land, much more than a country, much more than a people. It is an idea. And that idea is liberty, freedom. And then you added, freedom is a feminine concept.
Well, part of the experiment and part of the Masonic quest, that is the individual seeking to build a better self and to then build a better world, ultimately it relies on something very, very important. How does the Mason learn to find his own equilibrium, point of equilibrium, by balancing between the two aspects of the duality that exists in our world? Instead of pitting one against the other, instead of taking sides with one against the other, realizing that both are necessary, both complement each other, and the ability to rise above and see the whole thing. That's part of the equilibrium. So the masculine and the feminine are two very important aspects of the duality of life, the creation of the world, the physical world in which we live. And the feminine has been historically oppressed. If we read historical books in the way the human condition had progressed, the feminine was preserved by the mystery schools, the esoteric, what were called secret societies, who would then only transmit the knowledge of both the masculine and the feminine aspects of life and creation to the initiate, fearing obviously otherwise if they would do it in the open they would be accused of heresy, of blasphemy, or whatever it is, and that would cost them their life. That's number one. But there was another very important reason for keeping it in the schools of mystery. The person had to be ready. So it's for the seeker. It is not for mass production. So it is not made for anyone. It is made for everyone who is seeking. So it is part, and it's in the language of symbolism of Freemasonry, but also it is veiled, and this is why unveiling the symbolism by the individual to understand what lies behind these symbols are very important. So when we talk about enlightened freedom, that is the one that has the both at a state of equilibrium, and the feminine is very important. Now, you see freedom, liberty, typically represented by the feminine figure, feminine statue. The same for justice. Some of the great concepts that we cherish, let's say, universally, are represented by the feminine, but people don't focus much why. And this takes us back to some of the ancient traditions, back to the ancient Egyptians and the concept, the goddess Isis, and which explains to you why Egyptology and Egyptian symbolism exists also in Freemasonry. But it's not only going back to ancient Egypt. You find it in other traditions as well, in the Phoenician tradition, in the Zoroastrian tradition, in many of ancient traditions that mystery schools then took and transmitted.
Sure. The Sophia tradition.
The Sophia tradition. That's very well put. Yeah. So it's, and believe it or not, even many Freemasons don't focus on that feminine aspect as much, because the overwhelming majority of Freemasons are operating in the single-gendered fraternity of men, like in the United States. Most people don't know that there is feminine Freemasonry, which exists almost in every European country. Not as much in the United States. There are a few pockets, few places here and there. But because the focus is, and the tradition is around men who are joining lodges, and not much is talked about deciphering. For example, why do we talk about the moon? And what is the symbolism? So it's up to the individual Mason to start digging into, what is this? Why sun and moon? What are we talking about here?
And we'll see at Fetzer that a lot of the symbols are feminine symbols, so this opens the door to
yes, and you see
address it there when we talk to you about that too.
And you'll see that in this building where we are. The fact that you're going to see, number 8, which is associated with the feminine, the sacred feminine, number of Isis. So you're going to find 8 columns. You're going to see that number 8 in columns replicating or arches replicating itself in this building. You're going to find that in the Supreme Court building, Justice. So you have 16 columns, 8 by 8, again, because of the duality. But number 8 is associated with that, and some say it is no coincidence that the White House took 8 years to build.
Well, it seems like we're also talking about here with divine feminine, the notion of balance, light, dark, male, female. And could you talk a little bit more about that idea of balance within Freemasonry? Yes,
the balance is very important. So we talk about, there's the balance between feminine and masculine. Most Masons immediately see the balance between black and white. So you have the checkered floor, for example. There is the 2 columns, the person being initiated constantly or goes through a set of 2 columns, and then there are 2 globes, the celestial and the terrestrial, above as below, below as above. And the big story here behind that, all of that, is to tell the Freemason it is up to him to understand the duality and understand that it is part of the laws of nature, and not to pit one against the other, because if you do, you create disharmony. And the object of creating harmony is to put these two at a state of equilibrium. Now that translates in very practical ways in perfecting one's life as a builder to become a master builder of self and of community. So this is the reason why avoiding all forms of extremism are encouraged. Freemasonry doesn't tell the individual Mason how to do it. Again, there's no dogma, but it says you need to avoid extremism, because when you go into any form of extreme, you can't bring balance, you can't find your point of equilibrium, and you're no longer, therefore, master of your destiny. When you fall into extremes, you'll be constantly reacting instead of acting, and you're no longer exercising leadership, that is thoughtful, enlightened leadership. You're being driven by some other primitive primal forces, and that's not how to build. So it is all to teach the person in the end, you need to find your point of equilibrium and develop both aspects in your own life, and then the same thing in your community, in your society, in the world in which we live. And so it has very practical implications. The idea of Masonic teachings is not to have an interesting philosophical discussion or just a spiritual discourse. It is how do you then take that and apply it.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because we were talking earlier, and you mentioned that activism within the lodge wasn't encouraged, but activism outside the lodge is.
Absolutely. This is very important. The Masonry as an institution to preserve the integrity of its mission, that is not to become a dogmatic institution and profess one way of doing things. The institution itself, which is basically organized around what we call the lodge. The lodge is discouraged from doing anything as an institution in the community except charity. By contrast, it is the individual member of the lodge who is encouraged to take whatever he or she has learned from the Masonic experience within the lodge. That is, the lodge provides a sacred space for that person to pursue that quest and experiment without fearing reprisals, experiment how to improve himself. Take that and then put it into application in the world outside as a free individual. So with that concept of freedom comes the obligation. And that is why we take obligations. There are no duties unless you're an officer and you take on official responsibilities, administrative, managerial, etc. We push the concept of obligation because for us, in Freemasonry, obligation is what makes the person free. When you take on an obligation, you feel a sense of freedom that is unbelievable because you're not expecting anything and no one is expecting anything from you either. It's not duty. So we truly separate between obligation and duty. And often in the profane world, in our day-to-day lives, people use the two as if they were, synonymous. So there is an obligation here to improve yourself so you can improve the world. So what you see Masons do, instead of creating Masonic organizations, they create civic society, civil society groups, whether they're...
The Fetzer Institute.
The Fetzer Institute is a perfect example. It embodies, of course, his vision, and this is his way of putting into practice what he has learned, in Freemasonry. It makes absolute sense. It's the same way the Lions Club were established. It's the same way universities, Greek fraternities, so many civic groups that it's encouraged. Go ahead and do that. So instead of acting as an institution, you're acting as free Masons.
On a History Channel show a few years ago, Mr. Elias was interviewed. We referenced parts of that interview previously, and we'll make mention of it later on as well. On the show, Akram spoke about Washington, D.C., saying, quote, "There's no question that in the city of Washington many symbols exist and have to do with Freemasonry. The language of symbols was paramount, was essential to the American enterprise from the beginning," unquote. While we were with Akram in Washington, D.C., we went to and talked at many of the sites in D.C. which have Masonic symbolism. For this part of the video, the topic being the Masonic view and John Fetzer's view of America as a spiritual enterprise, we next go with Akram to discuss the symbols at the U.S. Capitol building, then to the Jefferson Memorial, then on to Lafayette Park in front of the White House, and finally to the National Cathedral.
This is the center of the way the city of Washington was designed. Very important that the founding fathers of the United States wanted the District of Columbia, the seat of the nation's capital, to be designed based on geometry and reason to reflect the essence of the new great experiment. So this is point zero. The District of Columbia is divided into 4 quadrants: northwest, southwest, northeast, southeast. And the intersection is right here, point zero, at the heart of the Capitol building. Just to physically, symbolically state that it is the Capitol building where the Congress convenes is the heart of the great American experiment from a political perspective. We're standing here in the Capitol Visitor Center. You hear a lot of noise behind me. They're busy taking down some of the materials and equipment that had to do with the special ceremony commemorating the proclamation of emancipation of the United States of America. But behind me you see a replica statue. That is a replica of Freedom statue. Freedom statue stands atop of the dome of the Capitol building. And Freedom statue faces east. In other words, she has her back to the National Mall. Now, the symbolism of that is very powerful. By facing east, he's facing the sun. That is, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So the east is the source of physical light, but esoterically, it represents enlightenment. And the message here is that true freedom is the result of enlightenment. So the same way an individual, to become a master of his/her destiny, to become truly free, the individual needs to seek enlightenment in order to defeat his or her biggest enemies: extremism, ignorance, and tyranny. Likewise, this great experiment that we call America, to remain truly free and live up to its spiritual foundation, it must constantly seek enlightenment and attempt to defeat ignorance, extremism, and fanaticism. And it is for that reason that you see also inscribed on the wall this sentence, "In God we trust," which became a second motto of the United States, of the great experiment. And please keep in mind that the word God here, in its original 18th century meaning, refers to the creative force, the supreme being. And the key word is trust, not believe. For I can believe in something because my parents taught me to believe in something, or I grew up believing in one religion or another. Trust is a free choice. And if I say I trust someone, it is based on my own experience, of my own free will. And the idea here is that the relationship between the individual and that supreme power should never be imposed. It should be based on trust. And as far as the United States is concerned, that simply means that this great experiment relies heavily on the idea of trusting in the providence that has willed to the establishment of this great experiment that we call America. We're standing here in front of the place commemorating the laying of the cornerstone of the United States Capitol by President George Washington on September 18th, 1793. That was done in a Masonic ceremony, scattering corn, pouring wine and oil on the stone in that ceremony. This was a fundamental ceremony that George Washington himself, wearing his Masonic regalia, led a Masonic parade down Pennsylvania Avenue from the site where the White House was being built to Jenkins Hill, which is Capitol Hill today, to lay that cornerstone, with the eyes of the nation on him, to basically send a very powerful message. This new great experiment is going to be governed based on the concept of enlightened freedom with the rule of the people, and the Capitol building is going to be the symbol of that majestic great experiment, not the White House. This is no longer about a czar, a king, a sultan, an emperor, a one person ruling over others. This is going to be a collective states coming together through a Congress, and through that Congress try to diffuse the light that will help promote prosperity, peace, and happiness among the people. We're standing here in the rotunda. This is the Holy of Holies of the United States Capitol building. And of course, topping the dome, you see the apotheosis of George Washington. It was done by Constantino Brumidi. Fantastic idea here. Typically, when we talk about the apotheosis, Brian, we're talking about, in ancient traditions, mysteries, the gods, etc. In this case, it's George Washington being elevated to the heavens. This is to underlie a very powerful message, and that is the great experiment has a spiritual foundation, and George Washington was the builder par excellence among the founders that helped usher in this great experiment, and is being honored by the gods. In other words, Providence was on the side of the American experiment. It is the destiny of the United States, and Washington deserves it, because Washington abandoned power when he could have declared himself king for life. He surrendered to the will of the people and handled himself in office, giving dignity to the office of the presidency without transforming it into a monarchy. So we're standing here in front of a painting depicting the historic laying of the cornerstone by President George Washington, that is the cornerstone of the United States Capitol, which he did on September 18th, 1793. Now that was done in a Masonic ceremony, which is very important, quite telling about the meaning of the great experiment and what the founding of America is all about. Now, an essential part of the ceremony is to scatter corn on the stone, pour some wine and some oil. And you can see in the painting 3 brethren, each one holding one of the vessels that contain, the oil, the corn, and the wine, which George Washington is going to use. And what is the symbolism of that? Is that corn represents prosperity, oil represents peace, and wine symbolizes happiness. And when a cornerstone of a public edifice, such as the United States Capitol, is laid Masonically, it is to send a powerful message to the people who would be working out of that building, that their main mission is not to rule over people, over others, not to subjugate people to their own whims, but rather to work in order to promote the peace, prosperity, and happiness of the people they're serving. And in Washington, D.C., many of the public buildings, including landmarks like the Washington Monument, the Smithsonian Institution, the Washington National Cathedral, to name a few, the White House, of course, their cornerstones were laid Masonically in this fashion. Okay, well, we're standing here in front of a painting commemorating the historic inauguration, first inauguration of the President of the United States, that is President George Washington. What is interesting about this ceremony, there are a couple of interesting facts that most Americans are not aware of. The first thing has to do with the taking the oath on a Bible that quite often is referred to in the media as the George Washington Bible. Well, there is no George Washington Bible. In other words, that Bible in which he took the oath was not his nor his family's. Here's what happened. At the ceremony, which was in New York, in what is called Wall Street today, Lower Manhattan, they never thought about the Bible being a necessary implement, for the ceremony itself. But Washington, having been a Mason, and you always take your oath and your obligations in Freemasonry on what's called the volume of the sacred law, whichever holy book you choose to believe in. So he said, I'm not taking an oath of office on nothing, so I need to have the Bible. And well, there was no Bible present. So he turned to Chancellor Livingston, who was running the ceremony, Chancellor of New York, and who was, of course, Grand Master. He said, why don't you send somebody to one of the lodges nearby and bring the Bible from the lodge room? Good idea. So they sent one of the brethren to go there and get it. That took about 32 minutes. Now, historically, the interesting thing about this is that this is the only time in American history when the president did not become president at 12 noon. We call it in the Masonic ritual high 12. It is on high 12 that the president of the United States is declared president. In this case, it was about 32 minutes late because of going to the lodge hole and bringing back the Bible. Now, the second interesting story about this had to do with the closing of the oath. In the constitutional oath, there was no "so help me God." George Washington ad-libbed. He just added those words because this is how one closes his Masonic obligation, the oath. We say, "So help me God," that is, "so help me that supreme power, intelligence," etc. So he added those words, and that became the tradition. So every president now says, "So help me God." So I thought there's two pieces of Americana that most people are not aware of. We're here at the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, honoring one of the founding fathers of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who became third president of this country. But most importantly, Thomas Jefferson had a unique contribution to the establishment of the Great Experiment. He's the main drafter of the Declaration of Independence, that fantastic document that really spells out the spiritual foundation, not religious, but the spiritual foundation of the Great Experiment, that we are all endowed with certain inalienable rights, and among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson was also the architect of the Articles of Freedom of Religion in the state of Virginia. This concept of freedom of religion, that is, having no official religion in this country, while at the same time giving the right to each and every individual to pursue the religion of their choice. And another fundamental contribution was in the area of education, the pursuit of knowledge. How can we have this great experiment, spiritually inspired, relying on the rule of the people, unless the people had the tools to pursue their own education and enlightenment? The elite can take care of itself. But if we are to have the rule of the people, the average citizen in this country should have access to education, to bettering himself or herself. So the rule of the people would not become the rule of the mob, but instead would be an enlightened rule of the people, for the people, and by the people. That is why he established the University of Virginia and laid out the foundation for higher public education in the United States. And that explains the connection here with the fraternity. Why? The concept of natural law, the natural laws that govern the universe, very important. Universal law, respecting all, at the foundation of this country, the support for education. And that is why Scottish Rite Freemason John Fetzer left a legacy behind and built an institute with the mission to help propagate this and help the Great Experiment and improve the human condition based on that spiritual foundation. It is no coincidence that John Fetzer had such an admiration for Thomas Jefferson and kept a copy of Thomas Jefferson's Bible close to him always to get inspired.
As we look at a shot of the Jefferson bust in the trustees' room at the Fetzer Institute, here is a quote from John Fetzer from an April 8, 1987 interview. John was talking about this very bust of Thomas Jefferson when he connected Jefferson to the Fetzer mission. Quote, "We are actually talking about a new Declaration of Independence, seeking again to bring about a new source of freedom to man which he has never experienced before. Because if man can really find that balance of mind, body, and spirit, then he will be in a position not only to handle his problems of living in the physical, but he will also be on a path traveling towards what? The soul, which is the ultimate goal." Unquote.
Standing here in front of the monument to General Kosciuszko, originally from Poland, the hero of the Battle of Saratoga in the war, Revolutionary War and War of Independence in the United States. Foreign-born, came here to work under George Washington and help the militia win the war against Britain. This park is called Lafayette Park, and Kosciuszko stands at one of the corners. Each corner in this park is dedicated to a foreign-born general who has come to the United States to help us in the War of Independence. And the common denominator between all four of them was the fact they were all members of the Society of Free and Accepted Masons. And one of the most important roles that Benjamin Franklin, who was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Philadelphia, did when he was in Paris as the US ambassador, was to preside over one of the most important lodges, Masonic lodges in Paris, in France. And through that connection, he helped recruit many officers from continental Europe to help train the militia and help George Washington win the war. So for many Masons, this park called Lafayette Park is also referred to as Fraternity Park. And while the White House was being built, Masons who were also stonemasons actually building the White House and came from Scotland would hold makeshift lodge meetings in the evenings in this park. So the park is really dedicated to the Freemasons that built the White House. Behind me is the statue of General Lafayette. The Marquis de Lafayette is one of the four generals honored in this Lafayette Park. Born in France, came to the United States again to assist in the War of Independence. The park is named after him, however, because he is first among equals, among all those generals who came to assist us in the War of Independence. Lafayette had a special role. He came on his own as a marquis, a member of the nobility in France, but truly believed in the spiritual foundation of an experiment. And what is that experiment? Is it at all possible for individuals of different backgrounds, of different walks of life, from different religions? Is it possible for diverse people to live under the same rule of law, to govern themselves by themselves, for themselves? And thirdly, fundamentally, enjoy individual enlightened freedom. And that presumes, obviously, responsibility. For without responsibility, there is no freedom. It is anarchy. No other person was ever honored the way Lafayette has been. And for anyone who goes into the chamber of the House of Representatives, this explains to you why. There are only two portraits in that chamber. The portrait of George Washington, the founder, the father of this country, and the portrait of the General Marquis de Lafayette, for his contribution was unique. After the United States won the war, Lafayette chose not to become a citizen of this country, but return to his mother country, France, and fight in the revolution, hoping to establish a similar order, another example of the great experiment in France. He was put in jail, and after he was freed, he played a key role in engineering some of the most important commercial and trade treaties between France and the United States, fulfilling part of that vision that through commerce, better relations can be built among nations. This helps avoid war and help humanity build always a better and more prosperous future. We're standing here in front of the White House. This is the executive mansion. The cornerstone of the White House was also laid Masonically on October 13th, 1792. However, George Washington did not want to lay the cornerstone himself. Washington wanted to preside over the ceremony of laying the cornerstone of the United States Capitol. That was done on purpose to send a powerful message to the citizens of this great United States of America that the symbol of this new republic is the Capitol, where the Congress of the United States convenes, not the White House, an executive mansion, where the president resides and works out of. The idea was to distance ourselves from the old order, which was represented by the absolutist monarchy, an emperor, a czar, a king, a sultan. This experiment was going to operate differently. And it is for that same reason that George Washington admonished Pierre l'Enfant, who was a Freemason, in designing the city of Washington. L'Enfant had picked a hill in the city of Alexandria, which was part of the District of Columbia at the time, to be the site of the United States Capitol. But because Alexandria was so close to Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington told him it is improper to have the seat of the Congress, the symbol of the new republic, be so close to my private property. Find another site on the other side of the Potomac River. And this is how we ended up with Capitol Hill today, all due to the leadership of George Washington, a Freemason, who, by example, established the parameters of the powers of the office. For let us not forget that there was a leap of faith in Philadelphia at the convention, the most controversial topic, the one discussion that almost disrupted the entire convention and could have put an end to the American experiment, had to do with the office and the powers of the presidency. In other words, Article 2 of the Constitution. But all eyes were laid on George Washington, trusting him to use power wisely, as a master would do, using his gavel. Well, I'm standing here in the Washington National Cathedral, and behind me is a statue of George Washington. Now, typically in a typical cathedral, one would find statues of saints, of Jesus' disciples, of Christ. In this cathedral, where there are many symbols, of course, relating to Christianity and Jesus Christ, you find statues such as the one of George Washington, whom we know was no saint. But George Washington was the founder of the great experiment that we call America, because this cathedral is symbolically a spiritual temple to honor the great experiment that is the United States of America. Washington was the builder of that experiment, so he is honored in this national cathedral. So the idea here is to honor and respect the diversity and the universality of spirituality, no matter what religion or what form, religious form, it expresses itself. Now, this statue of George Washington, who was a Freemason, was donated by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry to the cathedral. You see here down on the floor a constellation of stars, 13 stars representing the original 13 states, but arranged in the shape of a six-pointed star. That is the same six-pointed star that one sees above the eagle in the Great Seal of the United States of America. And the symbolism of the six-pointed star is that it is the seal of King Solomon. It's a symbol of wisdom. And that is to guide, it's enlightened wisdom to guide the United States, represented by the eagle in the Great Seal, that for the United States to remain free and independent in this world, it would have to balance wisely between the use of war, that is negative energy, and the building of peace, which is positive energy. In this world, the two are necessary. However, the aim of using force should always be to build peace, not to conquer, not to expand. Unlike the old order, the new order, built by the Great Experiment, is about improving the human condition and constantly work towards building greater peace. Now, the symbolism of the six-pointed star, that it's made up of two equilateral triangles. And the Masonic symbolism of that each equilateral triangle is made up of three equal sides representing the three key dimensions of the human being: the physical, the intellectual, and the spiritual. And a person becomes truly free, a master of her destiny, when one is able to nurture all three equally. There's harmony within that individual. And it's the same thing for the United States of America. Now, two triangles, however, one points from earth to heaven, and the other one pointing from heaven down to earth. At a state of equilibrium, they form the six-pointed star, referred to historically in Masonry as the seal of King Solomon, the wise king. This is to reflect the idea that above as below, below as above, there is always a connection to keep in mind. Now, since the cathedral is symbolically a temple for the spiritual foundation of the Great Experiment, we've seen earlier the statue of George Washington, the founder of that experiment, Washington being honored in this cathedral. You see now behind me a statue of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is the one person who saved the Great Experiment, because in the history of the United States, only once that experiment was truly endangered. Because of the ugly fight over slavery, that cancer that was eating at the heart of the experiment, destroying it from within, it had to be taken out. That fight led to a secession, a horrible civil war. It was the enlightened leadership and the wisdom of Abraham Lincoln that helped preserve the Great Experiment in the United States. So he deserves a place of honor right here in this Washington National Cathedral. And let us not forget that Abraham Lincoln wished by the end of his presidency to join the Society of Free and Accepted Masons, in which George Washington was also a member. But as we know, history, destiny had something else in mind. But when Abraham Lincoln said that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, in that famous Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln was connected with providence that destined from the beginning, willed the Great Experiment to be and to make sure that America has a major role to play in advancing the human condition. And by saving the Great Experiment, the United States continues to fulfill its mission even through the day. If we look at the floor here, you see the five-pointed star. Five-pointed star, which is the symbol of America. And what is the symbolism of number 5? We go back here again to the Society of Free and Accepted Masons. Number 5 is a number associated with the second degree in Freemasonry. It is the fellowcraft degree, the degree of the actual builder. George Washington was the builder of the new nation. This is why his monument in Washington, D.C. has measurements 555 feet in elevation and 55 feet by 55 feet at the base. 5. He was the builder par excellence. And the United States was the builder of a new order, and that is why its star is a five-pointed star. It is all about advancing the human condition, and the mission, the destiny of this country is not to allow humanity to repeat the ugly history of the past, but constantly look for, construct new ways to solve old problems, and in the process, advance the human condition. And the only way to do that is by preserving its spiritual foundation. The Washington National Cathedral is a unique landmark, not only in the city of Washington, but in this country, and possibly even in the world. It is designed to be a temple for the spiritual foundation of the great experiment that we call America. And it is for that reason that its cornerstone was laid in a Masonic ceremony by President and Freemason Theodore Roosevelt in 1907. It is for this reason that this cathedral has stained glass windows that have to do not only with Christianity and the life story of Jesus Christ, but also with the evolution of the great experiment and the two greatest Americans, the founder, George Washington, and the savior, Abraham Lincoln, both being honored with statues in this great cathedral. What also makes it unique, it is national in character, but what does that mean? There's no official religion in the United States. However, when a prominent American passes on, if he, his family, he or she, their family wishes it to be so, the official spiritual or religious ceremony in honoring that person can take place in this very specific cathedral in whatever form and ritual, no matter what denomination the person belonged to. This gives it this national character, honoring the diversity of religious experiences in the United States, which reflect the spiritual foundation of the great experiment. We're here at the Lincoln Memorial, a memorial to a giant, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, who saved the great experiment in this country. Only once in the history of the United States, the great experiment was endangered because of the conflict over slavery, which led to a secession, leading to a horrible civil war in which more than 600,000 Americans died. Lincoln, by winning the war, abolishing slavery, and preserving the Union, saved the great experiment. Now, Henry Bacon, the architect of this memorial, pondering upon the life of Lincoln and how he saw that conflict, what it was all about, he realized that Abraham Lincoln believed that he had a destiny to fulfill. And his destiny was to save the experiment, and if he were to be successful, America's destiny was to make sure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It is because of that spiritual foundation of that great experiment that Bacon came up with the idea that Lincoln's memorial had to be a temple, a spiritual temple. And the inspiration came from the Parthenon. Since we're talking about government of the people, by the people, for the people, giving credit to the ancient Greeks who introduced the concept of demoscrat, democracy. So he went to the Parthenon, that to get his inspiration, and came up with this fantastic, beautiful, majestic memorial. Now, Daniel Chester French, who was a sculptor, added to that by basically stating Greeks erected temples to their gods, and to please their gods, they offered sacrifice on altars. Well, here we are in a temple that is symbolically a temple for democracy. And for that, Abraham Lincoln, behind me, is seated on a pedestal, the pedestal symbolically representing an altar. And because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, he symbolically became the sacrificial lamb on the altar of democracy in the temple. What an extraordinary way to remember that great giant. And it is in this temple that Northerners and Southerners, Americans from all walks of life, from every part of the country, can come and feel they are all Americans. We're here at the memorial of Martin Luther King. Behind me you see Martin Luther King coming out of a piece of stone, and behind that, two pieces of rock. The symbolism here is to reflect an excerpt of the speech that Martin Luther King gave in 1963, "I have a dream. Out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope." And Martin Luther King is coming out of that stone. Powerful spiritual symbolism here. Instead of appealing to the instincts of people, pitting whites against blacks, blacks against whites, Martin Luther King appealed to the spiritual foundation of what it means to be an American, and inspired Americans to rise above the conflict and unite in a grand design to take the American experiment one step further into the future. Well, I'm here in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The National Mall, symbolically, is the Mount Olympus for the United States. The same way the Greeks on Mount Olympus honored their gods. Here in Washington, we honor on the National Mall those great Americans who fought hard for the establishment, the preservation, and the evolution of the great experiment. Now, on this mall, you have the majestic Washington Monument you see behind me. It is an obelisk, an Egyptian motif. The obelisk is pointing upward, and with the aid of the reflecting pool, we can see the monument pointing downward. And this is to reflect symbolically this concept once again, above as below, below as above. I'm standing here in front of the George Washington Monument, an Egyptian-styled obelisk dedicated to the memory of George Washington, first president, first among the founding fathers of the United States. And the first question that comes to mind, why an Egyptian-styled obelisk as a monument for our first president? What's the connection? We know very well that George Washington was not of Egyptian extraction. To understand that, it is important to reconnect with the vision of the founders, Washington included, their vision for the great experiment that we call America. Providence willed something, and the founders were the builders of that great experiment. Because they were builders, they looked for symbols that had to do with the effort of building, something that would be lasting. And the ancient Egyptians are considered to be some of the greatest masons, builders. They used stone, no metal, no cement, no concrete in their structures. And two of their most impressive structures were obelisks and pyramids. The pyramid one finds on the Great Seal of the United States of America. And the obelisk is prominently on display right here in Washington, D.C. at the heart of the National Mall. Obelisks were built by the ancient Egyptians, dedicated to the sun god Ra. An obelisk is a cross-section of a beam of light. And to the ancient Egyptians, the sun, Ra, was a god, the source of light, physical light, life and death on earth. In this case, we are talking about enlightenment. George Washington was the builder par excellence among the founders, coming together to establish a great experiment in enlightenment, an experiment that will hopefully take the human condition to the next level. It is for that purpose that his monument is an obelisk, a cross-section of a beam of light. Now, a beam of light also has to do with the concept of diversity within unity, the diversity of the 7 colors within the spectrum of white light. And George Washington helped bring together the diverse populations of the 13 colonies to form one union. Diversity within unity, the motto of the United States of America, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. The cornerstone of this Washington monument was laid also in a Masonic ceremony, similar to that of the White House, similar to that of the Capitol building, and so many other public edifices in the city. It was laid on July 4th, 1848, by the Grand Master of Masons of Washington, D.C., in the presence of the leaders of government of this country in this city, all gathered for that very important, spiritually founded and mysterious ceremony, dedicating the monument to George Washington, but symbolically the concept of diversity within unity, essential to the preservation and the success of the great experiment. Freemasons, as well as mystery schools, often use obelisks because obelisks represent that powerful symbol of building whose essence is coming from the universal spirit to help always build a better condition for humanity. We're by the entrance doors of the Library of Congress. The dual entry doors, we see the goddess imagination on one side and the goddess of memory on the other side. And each one is topped by a stylized winged Horus. Now, imagination refers to possibly the subconscious. Imagination refers to the creativity, the future. Memory refers to the conscience, but also preserving the tradition. The main reading room in the Library of Congress really represents the enlightened mind. You see the various pillars representing law, commerce, the arts, and so on. We see this room shaped as an octagon, and there are 8 pillars in this room, 8 being the number representing the sacred feminine. It is the aspect of feminine wisdom. In the main reading room, we have 2 pillars with a window in between. The religion pillar is on the left, science is on the right, and with the window representing great enlightenment in between. The seal of the United States surrounded by symbols of the states. Again, this is to symbolize how it is through enlightenment that we bring science and religion together, not to conflict with one another, but to complement one another. And this goes to the heart of the great experiment that we call the United States of America. And you can see here Henry, Simone, and Shakespeare. Yes, and Plato, Bacon. At the top of the stairway in the Great Hall of the Library of Congress,
we see this beautiful mosaic of Minerva. Minerva or Sophia, it basically represents enlightened wisdom. The sun in the mosaic is the source of light because we need enlightened wisdom to help us accomplish the things that we see listed in the scroll that Minerva is holding. Oh, the mosaic was done by Elihu Vedder, who was a Freemason. Interesting. Now we're looking also in the Great Hall, but we're looking at the floor, at the center, this square-looking room, which I refer to really as the Temple of Knowledge. This is the Holy of Holies, the Sanctum Sanctorum of the Temple of Knowledge, which is the Library of Congress. And you see right here in the center of the room, on the floor, the blazing sun. And all around the squared room, the 12 symbols of the zodiac. Again, representing here the connection between here and below, the celestial and the terrestrial. And it is only through enlightened spirit that we can gain a greater understanding of who we are here and where we're going. To reach that higher level of consciousness, enlightenment is necessary for the spirit to reign. At the foot of the 2 staircases in the Great Hall of the library, we see figures, in fact, 2, each one holding an electric light to celebrate the electric discoveries of Benjamin Franklin, who was a Freemason and the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge, Philadelphia. On the main floor of the Great Hall, we see a bust of Thomas Jefferson. Happens to be light in color. And then we see the bust of George Washington, but happens to be dark, black. And this is to reflect this concept of duality, darkness and light, the opposites, which may appear as opposites to the ordinary eye, but to the initiated eye, to the enlightened spirit, one recognizes that both are necessary, both are complementary, and it is through enlightenment that we bring them into balance to achieve harmony within, in order to promote harmony without. And here now we enter one of the quite esoteric rooms of the Library of Congress, the 4 Elements room. This room is dedicated to the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Now, in Freemasonry, earth is associated with the physical. Air is associated with the emotional nature of the human being. Fire is associated with the intellect, the intellectual pursuit. And water symbolizes the spirit. These 4 are so important to keep in balance. That relates This analogy of the four elements and how Freemasonry associates them to the emancipation of the human being.
We're here at the FDR Memorial. What you see behind me is a section of the walls that exist in this memorial, made up of stones, and if you look carefully, you will discover that each and every one of those stones is unique, either in its shape, color shading, or size. And the idea behind it is that to come together and build this great country, and more importantly, the temple of humanity, that each and every citizen can keep his or her individuality, but would need to also compromise on the edges, smoothen the edges in order to build next to, above, below someone else, so we can build the sense of community. So it's all about a balance between preserving the individuality, not losing it, but at the same time building the sense of community. And when we fail to do that, we face war, and that's where you see these stones, as we call them in Masonry, rough ashlars, that stones that refuse to compromise on the edges, to live next to and along with others and form that sense of community. FDR was committed to that spiritual quest, helping Americans rise above fear, rise above divisions, and employ diversity to enrich the great experiment, and always moving it a step forward to higher grounds. It is during that great period of the 30s, turmoil, after the Great Depression that hit the United States in 1929, so many people became unemployed, the economy came to a stall, a lot of people fell into severe poverty. The period of the 30s was a very trying period, and it was FDR's enlightened leadership, tapping into that spiritual foundation of America, that helped Americans overcome that difficult period. There's another fundamental part that I'd like to show you in this memorial. And as you can see behind me, you see the official statue of FDR. But the one part I would like to attract your attention to is that passage carved in the wall. Now, most Americans would not even know where that came from. Most Americans of a certain age would remember the famous saying by FDR, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Yet, that is not what we see on the wall next to his statue. He's talking here about the new order. This is taken out of a speech he gave in response to Adolf Hitler, who claimed to establish a new order for the mighty, for the strong. Democracy was a product of the weak, to serve the weak. Well, there was no way on earth that a Freemason like Franklin Delano Roosevelt could remain silent, because it was the founding fathers of the United States that introduced the concept of a new order based on enlightened freedom, rule of people, and rule of law. So he had to say, what they call new order is neither new nor order. George Washington and the founders of the United States truly believed that Providence was on their side. They had a destiny to fulfill, establish a great experiment that will help take the human condition to the next level. And because of that, the ceremony to lay the cornerstone and the foundation of the White House was done in a Masonic fashion, filled with mystery. The Freemasons were involved in laying the cornerstone, in actually building the White House itself. That school of mystery, so important to that spiritual foundation of the great experiment that we call America. And that is the reason why, when President Truman was in this White House and the decision was made to renovate and renew the White House with new fixtures, plumbing, etc., modernize it, and the White House, the president moved to Blair House across the street. In the process of doing this work, they discovered a lot of those original stones that were carved and prepared, fit to build the building by those Scottish stonemasons who were Freemasons, and each one had left his own Masonic mark on it. So President Harry Truman, Grand Master of the Freemasons of Missouri, thought it was fit that each Grand Lodge in this country would have a piece of that history of the White House. So 49 stones were picked, one given to each one of the Grand Lodges of the 48 states at the time, and to Washington, D.C. Interesting, and mysterious.